It's also a threat to democracy. Why do I say that? I say that because anybody who buys into the conspiracy myth, and I do not say conspiracy theory because theories can be proven, but to the conspiracy myth, which is the cornerstone of anti-Semitism, has accepted the notion, the far-fetched notion, that the Jews control the banks, the media, the Jews control the electoral process, et cetera, has essentially given up on democracy.
Good morning and welcome to Washington Post Live, co-produced with the Capehart podcast. I am Jonathan Capehart, associate editor for the Washington Post. The Office of the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism at the State Department was created 20 years ago. And today, the work of the office is more important than ever. Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt is the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, and she joins me now. Ambassador Lipstadt, welcome to Washington Post Live. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you, Jonathan. I think the last time I saw you was in an airport, which is where I spend a lot of time.
Yes, you do. You always have a roller bag with you whenever I see you, Ambassador. So before we discuss your office, I want to start with the news yesterday that the UN Security Council adopted a resolution endorsing the three-phase ceasefire plan for the Israel-Hamas war announced by President Biden on May 31st. Why is it important for both sides to accept this ceasefire plan?
Well, yeah, let me make something clear to begin with. My remit is overseas, that's correct, but I have many colleagues in this building around the world, in the Middle East, at the UN, who are directly dealing with the conflict Israel-Gaza, Israel-Hamas. So I don't want to enter that, but where I do think it's important is that contingent with events of October 7th and starting almost immediately thereafter, worldwide, we've seen a surge in anti-Semitism, more than a surge, a tsunami of anti-Semitism. So if we can end the conflagration, if there can be a ceasefire with all the contingencies that are part of that, then maybe we can begin. We've been addressing this rise, but maybe we can see some sort of leveling off of the anti-Semitism.
And so, Ambassador, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu often labels critics like the International Criminal Court as being motivated by anti-Semitism. Is that how you see it in your role?
No, I think to be quite clear, and I think many Israelis, including Israeli government officials with whom I've spoken even before October 7th, but certainly since October 7th, acknowledge that criticism of the state of Israel, the policies of the state of Israel, is not anti-Semitism. If that were the case, the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have been in the streets on Saturday nights before the beginning of the war about judicial reform, and since then in recent weeks about the conduct of the war, would be anti-Semites, and that of course is ridiculous. Many of them come straight from the battlefield and then join the protest. So we're not talking about criticism of the state of Israel. Look, if someone criticizes American policy, they're not anti-American. They might be, but that doesn't make them anti-American. What we look at is when those criticisms morph over into anti-Semitism, or even worse, are rooted in anti-Semitism. We're against Israel because Israel is, and then comes a stream of anti-Semitic motifs, anti-Semitic tropes associated with Jews, but now referenced in connection to Israel. But when we hear chants on the campuses and in other places, hearing them and sometimes in the center of Washington, globalize the Intifada. The Intifada meant the death and the maiming of thousands of Israelis, of Jews, of people in Israel. You globalize, you're talking about attacking Jews worldwide. Or when you torch a synagogue, or you attack a Jew walking across a campus or Times Square or at the center of Berlin because they're wearing a yarmulke, that's anti-Semitism. So that's where we see the connection.
You say anti-Semitic, and this is, we showed it in the clip, in the intro to this, where you say anti-Semitism is rooted in and propped up by a conspiracy myth, not a conspiracy theory. What is that myth?
That myth is that the Jews, because of they're small in number, but because of their inordinate and diabolical, malicious, sneaky, conniving, I can use lots of other negative words that I hear in these charges all the time. Because of that, they're small in number, but they're able to punch above their weight and control things that would normally be way out of the control of a particular group. These are not new stereotypes. These are not new charges. These are rooted in anti-Semitic charges that are thousands of years old, which, like a virus, adapt themselves to a new situation.
I want you to repeat what you said in the intro when you talked about the conspiracy myth, and you intentionally used the word myth and not theory. Why don't you use theory? Why isn't it a conspiracy theory?
Theories can be proven. You know, we talk about the theory of evolution. Any sane-minded person knows that evolution is a real thing. They can see it in different extensions or whatever. But I don't want to suggest that there's any truth to this myth of Jewish control of all sorts of power or all sorts of areas of the society. Now, remember, there might be many Jews involved in a particular profession, in a particular area of culture or whatever, but that's not the Jews. Anybody who knows the Jewish community, and Jonathan, I think you have know the Jewish community pretty well, know that 2 Jews, 3 opinions. There is no the control of any aspect of the society. You know, people often say Jews control the universities because they're such large donors. If that were the case, what we've seen on the university campus, both in this country and abroad, I just returned from 2 weeks in Scandinavia, wouldn't be happening.
Right. And I was laughing at that point you're making because it just shows the absurdity of some of these myths that have gripped people for millennia. I want to follow up on a rather disturbing poll. A fifth of Americans aged 18 to 29, Ambassador, believe the Holocaust was a myth. And this is according to a poll from the Economist YouGov in December 2023. Does this surprise you? And what would you attribute this to?
It doesn't surprise me. It doesn't shock me. It surprises me a bit because we've had so much attention to Holocaust education. We've had so much attention to the Holocaust as portrayed in movies, some good, some bad, some more worthwhile, some less so at museums. So, you know, it strikes me that for the Holocaust to be a myth, what has to be untrue? Well, certainly the thousands of pages of documents which document what happened during the Holocaust. The Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. Those would all have to be untrue. The Nazis left us a tremendous record, a precise record, including drawings of the gas chambers indicating what they did. So those would have to be untrue. The testimony of survivors would have to be untrue. The testimony of people who lived near the death camps or who lived near the shooting sites, because remember, over 1 million Jews were shot on the Eastern Front, would have tell the story. They would have to be lying. The liberators, whether Soviet liberators, American liberators, would have to be making it up. And most of all, the perpetrators, the Germans themselves, who say we did it, acknowledge it, over and over again would have to be making it up. Holocaust deniers have no evidence, no narrative, no witnesses, no documents, no nothing. And yet here it is believed. So you got to ask why. And I find at the heart of it, at the foundation of it, a certain degree of, not a certain degree, a great degree of anti-Semitism. This belief that the Jews could be capable of this thing. Even when you say to a denier, well, what about the Nuremberg trials? And all the Germans who acknowledge that it happened, they say, oh, the Jews are also powerful that they forced the Germans to do this. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been allowed back into the family of nations. It makes no sense. Where are one out of every three Jews who was killed? They disappeared. They're not here. They didn't ever reappear. So the idea of the Holocaust being a myth is so absurd that you have to ask why. And I find in its root anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm. I have to put you on the spot because you said there have been lots of Holocaust movies, some good, some bad. The first thought in my mind was, wait, well, name a bad Holocaust movie.
Oh, I'm not going to do that. I've been before I was a diplomat, I might have said so, but I've learned in over 2 years. I'll be quiet about that. But there's some very
okay. I had to try. So you've also said that anti-Semitism and racism are deeply intertwined. It's not just that anti-Semitic people often are also hold racist views. It's deeper than that. Explain.
Well, I think that first of all, when you other a group, when you say that group is not part of who we are, they are other, they outside the general society. You can start with the Jews. Once you do that vis-a-vis the Jews, then it's very easy to do that vis-a-vis other groups. So that's one way in which they're connected. They're also connected by something that has gained a certain traction in recent years called the Great Replacement Theory.
Oh,
Let me take
yes.
you back to Jonathan. Jonathan, something I'm sure you remember well, Charlottesville in this country. When those marchers were marching across the campus of the University of Virginia, will not replace us. I got calls from people saying, what are they talking about? Because this was ostensibly a march about the taking down of statues of heroes to the Confederacy, but perpetrators of a war against the Union, of slavery, etc. And I explained that there is a theory out there, perpetrated mainly by people on the far right, extremist far right, and sometimes they're not so extreme, that there is a plan afoot to allow the entry into democratic countries of hordes, and I use that word in quotation marks, of people of color, Africans, Muslims, non-Christians, to destroy Christian hegemony, to destroy the ability of or Christian society, particularly in Europe and in the Americas. And who is behind that, the theory goes? Who is perpetrating that? Well, they say who benefits from that? Who has the ability to do it? Who can control things behind the scenes? The Jews. So that this becomes a Jewish plot. So one of the things that has so troubled me in recent months is the tensions that have come out about Jews being oppressors, Jews, from the left, you hear that Jews are all white and therefore they're oppressors. Not from all the left, of course not, but from the far extremist left, we hear this on campus and in other places. And from the right, we hear Jews are not white and they're trying to overthrow a white society. So it shows you the absurdity of prejudice in general and the absurdity of anti-Semitism.
So as you're talking, it makes me think about the European elections and the rise really of the far right. I mean, the far right parties won big in those elections over the weekend, particularly in Italy and France, where French President Macron, I mean, President Biden was barely off the ground and the elections happened and President Macron announced snap elections. His term isn't over until 2027 because of how poorly his party did in European election. I'm just wondering, what do you think is driving this rightward shift, and what could it mean not only for Jews in Europe, but also immigrants who are often scapegoated by these far right groups?
It's a very complex problem, and every place I've traveled, particularly since October 7th, on the European continent, you hear people struggling with it. There's a struggle that many of the government officials with whom I've spoken know that the far right, the extremist right, will use this as an excuse to attack center left, center parties, to pull things to the right. On the other hand, there also is a concern that in certain cases, and I want to be very careful here, I'm not suggesting that everyone, the majority, but there are certain places, including in this country, where we see recent migrants, where we see recent arrivals, where we see foreign students engaging in some of these actions. And it gives fodder to those who would like to blame everything on immigrants, which of course is crazy and extreme.
I'm going to pick up on, here in the United States, we're also contending with our own far right political movement. Um, you know, could you talk about real quickly the origins? What are the roots of the America First movement and that ideology?
The American First movement, to a great extent, goes back to World War II, though there, of course, were anti-immigrant sentiments. You can really track it from the latter part of the 19th century, as there were more Jews coming to this country, as there were more Catholics coming to this country, as there were more Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, in short, non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, non-white Anglo-Saxon
Hmm.
Protestants. There began to be a hostility towards immigrants. And it increased very slowly, and then it would ebb. Sometimes, if there was a labor shortage, it would go down. So it continued, but America First really got its great strength, or its moment of glory, and I use glory in inverted commas, during World War II as an isolationist movement. Let's
Hmm.
not get involved in European affairs. We got involved in Europe in World War I, and look what happened. It didn't do us any good. So let's not get involved in it now. And it was isolationist until the bombs were dropped on Pearl Harbor.
And listening to you talk about that, I mean, those are echoes of what we're living through now are echoes of what you're talking about
That's right.
from,
That's
there's
right.
World War One and World War Two. Are there conditions that enable these ideas to flourish? That what was happening 80 years ago is now the echoes of those things we're hearing now and experiencing now?
Yes. Whenever there's, no, I don't want to say categorically whenever, but often, very often, when there's an upheaval in society, when economies change, when cultures change, when people lose long-standing jobs, um, the people, particularly those who are impacted by it, but not only those, look for someone to blame. Who's causing this? Who's making this happen? And if you were to say the left-handed people or the people who ride bicycles are at fault and they're making this happen, we would say, let's get you off to a psychiatrist to address your problems because you're clearly fantasizing. But if you say, in the case of anti Semitism, the Jews, people tend to believe it. Well, I'm not an anti Semite, but I think I've heard about this before. I've seen this before. I've heard that the Jews control, going back, remember, to the conspiracy myth I was talking about at the beginning. By the way, one should also acknowledge that in our country, often that's the case with people of vis-a-vis people of color.
Oh yeah.
If I were to, when people talk about, I remember the great debates during some of the reform of the welfare system during the Clinton era, et cetera, and they talked about single mothers on welfare. And the assumption amongst many people was, of course, you're talking about single young Black women. And of course, the facts were, people who knew the facts and they came out, were that most of the single mothers on welfare were white women. Or in another way, if I were to say to you, I would say to some American, not to you, Jonathan, to some American. I was walking home from the metro last night and I got mugged. I got jumped by a group of teenagers, of rowdy teenagers, thugs. And they took my phone and they took my purse. And I'm just lucky I didn't emerge with any physical harm. The image that most Americans, I'm willing to say, I don't have any proof on this, but I'm willing to suggest, to stand by it. Many Americans, maybe not most, many Americans would have, that must have been black teenagers. And if I say to them, oh no, they were white, the person would say, oh my God, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that. So you fall into pre-existing prejudices. So that anti-Semitism, which historians often call, and rightfully so, the oldest or the longest continuous hatred, has such deep roots in the DNA, in the soil. Maybe that's a better way of putting it, in the soil of our society, that it's so easy to fall back on these anti-Semitic tropes. Whether you're talking about a real Jew, you're talking about an imaginary Jew, or even if you're talking about the state of Israel.
Let's talk about you for a moment, Ambassador. You are one of the world's foremost historians of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. How have you brought that wealth of knowledge and expertise and that historical context to your role now at the State Department?
It's come in sadly, particularly in the past 8 months, very, very handy, if one can say that. I recognize it when I see it. I've studied it so long. Not only have I studied it, but as you well know, Jonathan, I was subjected to it when I was put on trial in London, sued for libel by a Holocaust denier. I saw it up close and personal for 12 weeks in the courtroom. So it often I know of what I speak on a very personal level. I can also put things in a historical context. In the intro to this interview, you said the reference was that I compared this to the 1930s. Now I want to be more explicit here. I don't compare the situation we're seeing today to 1938 or 1939, when the Nazi regime was at the height of its power. Was oppressing Jews horrifically, was beginning the war that, of course, would lead to the annihilation of 1 out of every 3 Jews on the face of the earth. I talk about 1931, or even maybe 1928, 29, when Weimar Germany, a new democracy, the interwar democracy in Germany, was in a very fragile state and was being attacked by these forces of Nazism who were relying so specifically on Jew hatred, pure and simple, the most vile kind of Jew hatred. And it was, it played right into the weaknesses of Weimar Germany. And the problem is, and it's not just Germany, it was other countries as well, the governments either were participating and supporting this kind of view, or we're looking the other way. Oh, it's not real. Oh, it's not important. Even in our country, just a little over a year ago, the Biden-Harris administration released the first ever national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. And I was privileged to be one of the people who spoke at the launch of the strategy from the White House. And we were in the executive office building, the building next to the White House, which used to be the home of the State Department. During that period was the home of the State Department. And I acknowledged in my remarks introducing the strategy that I was speaking but of yards, meters from where decisions were being made on who should be allowed into this country and who shouldn't, who should be allowed visas and who shouldn't, based on whether they were Jews or not. They ticked off all the other boxes, but because they were Jews, the State Department, officials in the State Department said, no, don't let them in. So, and today, so that was then. Today, it's very different. Today, I just came back from Scandinavia, where a number of countries have issued national plans on fighting anti-Semitism, where countries have officials who address anti-Semitism. We will be gathering next month in July in Buenos Aires, many of the envoys who deal with this issue, to discuss how our governments are doing, what can we do better, how can we cooperate. We hope to introduce best practices, guidelines for fighting anti-Semitism. So the good news, let me start with the good news. I'm going to get to the bad news. Just hold on. Not surprisingly. The good news is that today, more often than not, governments are standing up to address it. And that's a sea change from the 1930s where we began this conversation. The difference is, or the bad news is that we haven't seen that in the whole of society. And not to knock my host, the Washington Post, or the media, but the media group, the media in general, and even the Washington Post to a certain degree in particular, has often fostered that view. Fostered that. I don't think consciously I'm not suggesting that at all. Let's spread anti-Semitism. But when it talks about Jewish interests, when it talks about rich, powerful Jews forced the New York City police to bring down the encampment, or when on college campuses, on the stellar campuses of our country, graduation speeches are given about rich and powerful people who tried to stop me from coming here. When we see overt anti-Semitism in other parts of society, amongst some of our leading students, again, at our leading campuses, and not just in this country, but abroad as well, I worry. So the irony is today we see governments taking this seriously. When I travel the world, and since I've entered office, I've made, I think, 35 country visits to maybe 25 different countries. In most cases, governments recognize this because the important thing is, and before we talked about anti-Semitism as a threat to democracy, it's not, and Jonathan, it's not just a threat to democracy, it's a threat to national security and national stability. Bad actors, malign influencers, be they other governments, be they NGOs, be they terrorist organizations, be they people with active internet, bots, etc., use this issue of anti-Semitism as a way of stirring up the pot, as a way of creating hostility between groups, as a way of making democracies look like failed states. During the COVID epidemic, the height of the COVID epidemic, we know that there were foreign countries, Russia amongst them, that were putting up pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine postings on the internet. Now, why would you do pro and anti? It wasn't the vaccines you were concerned about. It's you wanted Americans to be yelling at each other. You wanted Americans to feel like, oh my God, our society is crumbling. Even those who weren't yelling stood aside and said, what's wrong with our society? So my challenge is, when I go to these other countries, is think of anti-Semitism as a multi-layered way, as a threat to Jews. Think of it as a threat to democracy, as we've talked about, and think about it as a threat to national security and stability. This is a national security threat which has to be taken seriously, not just by governments, but by whole of society.
Ambassador, we have less than 2 minutes left. I do want to point out that when you talked about being taken to court in London, you wrote a book called History on Trial: My Day in Court with David Irving. It was turned into a movie. Rachel Weisz played you. So I put that out there so people can either get the book or see the movie or both. But I want to end by giving the last question to a member of our audience. This question comes from Andrea Foreman from Nevada, and she asks, how should we approach free speech on campuses and in other demonstrations when there's so much anti-Semitism and hate coming from them? We don't want to forbid speech, but what's the solution?
I can answer, Andrea, by citing what my boss, the President of the United States, and the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, have said numerous times. We believe in free speech. Free speech can be a pain in the neck. It can be difficult. You have to listen to ugly things. But free speech doesn't mean breaking the law. Free speech doesn't mean stopping students from going to class because they're Jews, or until they tell you how they stand on the recent events in the Middle East. Free speech is free speech. Breaking the law, stopping others from speaking, harming them is not free speech. That is violence. that is breaking the law, and we've got to differentiate.
Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, thank you very much for coming to Capehart on Washington Post Live.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. For more of these important conversations, sign up for a Washington Post, a free trial of the Washington Post by visiting the website you see there on the screen, washingtonpost.com/live. Again, that's washingtonpost.com/live. I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor at the Washington Post. Thank you for watching Capehart on Washington Post Live.